Hi, I'm Kent. Let's make your first plaster mold for slip casting. In this video, we're going to make a very simple plaster mold we can use for slip casting. This video is part of a series. The end goal is to be able to draw a sketch of a form and then have the computer do all the heavy lifting and spit out something that we can just 3D print and create a plaster mold for slip casting. We're a little ways away from that. To get there, we're going to iterate on our mold features and the associated complexity. This is the start. We're going to start with the simplest mold possible. This is a great way to make your own first slip casting mold. The easiest mold to make is a one-piece mold of an existing form. The final pot will have the same shape as that form, but since clay shrinks, it'll actually be a scaled down version. You can copy many different objects. I actually recommend starting with a plastic object. Here are a couple of containers. This one is an old food container that I've washed out, and it's the one we're going to make a mold of today. This one is a tub that I use to store different ingredients and occasionally mix things up. I have quite a collection of different types of containers. Most of these will work. So this container here I actually used to make this mold. It fits down inside just like that. So it's a copy and results in this type of finished pot. You can see how much smaller the pot is. It's the same shape, but it's scaled down. I've also made copies of existing plastic planters. So this one here, I made this relatively big mold. Again, exactly fits inside. Made the mold around it as a one-piece mold. Pour slip in there, and when it's done, wind up with pots like this. So in this video, we're going to make a copy of this one. We're going to basically do the same thing. We want to go ahead and create plaster around the outside, just like I did here, and that will then create a pot that is the shape. So as I mentioned, plastic containers are a good starting point. They tend to be relatively smooth on the outside. I'm going to be a little bit careful with the container you pick. So this one here has a lip on the edge, and I don't think we'd want to cast that. These little ones do as well. That's part of the reason I'm picking this food container here, is it's smooth all the way around. The other reason we want to use plastic as opposed to, say, copying an existing pot is that the plastic has a couple of features going for us. So when it's in the plaster, we actually need to be able to pull this out. And so being able to flex the plastic a little bit can be helpful. It can release the plastic from the plaster itself and help us get out. The other thing is that there are draft angles. So these are angles built into the sides of the pot. They aren't straight up and down, they're actually tilted in towards the bottom a little bit. Here as well. Pretty much all these plastic containers have that feature. The draft angles are important because we want to be able to slide the plastic master out of the plaster itself. Let me do a quick demo. We're going to use these sanding blocks as a prop. They're different colors, so hopefully you can tell them apart relatively easily. Let's assume that the black is the plaster and the red is the pot. So we'll put this side by side here. So what we want to do is be able to slide the plastic out. So if the plaster is on the bottom and the pot's on the top, obviously we can pull it this way, no problem, it will release. What happens if we start moving this at an angle? So the idea is we're going to want to slide it out, and again we can get it to release. So that's a good draft angle. Here we can see the draft angle is pretty steep, so maybe something like this. And again, we can pull it apart and it separates. As soon as we go straight up and down, now the plastic would be sliding against the plaster. And there's a whole lot of surface there, and they will just rub against each other. That will make it very difficult to get out. Even with just a slide angle, sometimes that's a problem. And of course, if we go the other direction, we can't push the plastic through the plaster or upside down. That would be just silly, of course. However, this actually points to one of the limitations of one-piece molds. We need the whole pot to be able to have a draft angle so we can pull it out. As soon as there is something underneath, we wouldn't be able to pull it. So here is a bone dry pot that I made. And the top here has a good draft angle. So again, with the plaster, we could pull it this way. However, as soon as we're in the bottom, the pot would be running into the plaster. So we can't have any forms where they bulge out with a one-piece mold. We can get around this, but that will be future videos. So that's a quick demonstration of what draft angles are. And again, because of the way these plastic pieces are made, they have draft angles built in. There are some bottles that don't, but it'll be pretty obvious. There should be a relatively steep angle to the piece that we want to be able to use to our advantage. Of course, that limits the types of forms we could make, but again, this is our very first plaster mold that we're going to try. All right, great. So we've picked out an object. It's plastic, it's nice and smooth, it has the draft angles in it. This will be the shape of our pot. To slip cast this, that means we need to have plaster on the outside, and that means we need to have something to catch the plaster on the outside as well. So we need another container. And that container obviously needs to be bigger than this. We actually want about 1 inch worth of plaster, 25 millimeters on all the sides. One of the simplest things to use is a bucket. So I've collected a bunch of buckets as well, and we can think about how this would fit in here. So this one here would work okay. There's a fair bit of space around the outside. This one's probably a bit better. It's a little bit less space. Again, we want draft angles, so you can look at this bucket and see how it's tilted in. This one has slightly less of a draft angle, but it's pretty flexible, so I think we can be safe using this as a mold. In fact, I've actually used this before. So the idea is we will put our mold form inside of here, put the bucket on the outside, and then we'll pour plaster and fill up the plaster all in this area. If you don't have a bucket that's just the right size, you can use one that's bigger, as I mentioned. It's ideal to have a more uniform thickness of plaster all around. That helps with the water absorption. It also just uses less plaster. And there are options besides buckets as well. We'll cover those in future videos. One of the nice advantages of buckets is they don't leak. And trust me, leaking plaster all over your bench, it's not really a fun experience. You can go look at a few videos I have of plaster disasters. It's not the end of the world, it's just a big mess. So we'll use these two as our forms. And then the other thing you'll need is some buckets for mixing. You want at least 2, maybe 3. You'll want one for the dry plaster, one for the water, and potentially one to mix in. You'll also want a mixing paddle to mix the plaster up. Some people mix their plaster up by hand. That's actually not the manufacturer's recommendations. You can try it if you want, but again, I recommend doing what the manufacturer wants. Basically, the more vigorous you mix the plaster, the stronger it will be. So I think if you mixed it by hand, you'd wind up with a relatively weak plaster. I've never done that before. There are videos on YouTube showing it successful. I just don't know how variable that process is. The shape of the paddle head also probably matters. You want to induce as little bubbles as possible into the plaster, but to start with, for your first mold, just use what you've got. All right, so this is what we'll use to mix the plaster. And last up is the plaster itself. So this comes in 50-pound bags, 22 kilos, and this is from USGS #1 Pottery Plaster. I highly recommend using this specific plaster, especially if you're in the US. If you're somewhere else, go talk to your local pottery shop about which plaster to use. But this plaster was specifically designed for pottery. It's in the name even. The reason this is special is that the plaster will form all these little microcrystals, and you want to be able to suck the water out of the slip at the right rate, and then that water will then pass through the plaster and then outside the outside edges. Different plasters will have different properties with that regard. So potentially you could use a different plaster, but again, to start with, I want to set you up for success. Use the right plaster. All right, that's all the stuff we need. Now we can start moving towards actually mixing up the plaster. The next thing we need to do is figure out how much plaster we need. So to do that, we need to figure out the volume of the space between our mold for our pot and the container for the plaster. So how much space is in here? There's a couple ways to do that. One is to fill this up, and then subtract the difference. The other is to go ahead and place this in here and just fill up this area here. So we don't have to do any math that way. This is going to displace some of the volume here. The problem is this will want to float, and we're going to have to deal with this when we put it in for the plaster as well. But for right now, we can just hold it. There's a couple ways we can measure this. We can measure it by volume, or I'm actually going to measure it by weight. And I'm going to use metric for this. It'll make our lives a lot easier. So here's our scale. Turn it on. So our bucket here weighs like 110 grams, but we can put that on. Pour in some water. Do this off the scale actually. So we need a little bit more water than that. All right, need to go a little bit further. All right, that's just about full, so I think that's good. Now we can let this out and put it back on our scale. So we basically have 29, 60 and change, so we'll call it 3,000. So we have 3,000 grams, which equals which equals 3,000 milliliters, which equals 3 liters. Since this is water, 1 gram is 1 milliliter. So it makes our math really easy. So we're going to need 3 liters of plaster. And you can see this area here is how much we've displaced. So now we know how much plaster we're going to need. How do we turn that into measurements of dry plaster and water? So it turns out for each milliliter that we want to fill up with plaster, we need 1 gram of dry plaster. So if you had 100 milliliters to fill up, you'd want 100 grams of dry plaster. Here we have 3,000 milliliters, so we're going to want 3,000 grams or 3 kilograms of dry plaster. As for water, you actually want a 70 to 100 ratio. So 70 parts of water and 100 parts of plaster. And again, we want 3 times our 0.7. That's our 70 to 100 ratio. So we get 2.1 liters of water. Where did that 0.7 come from, that 70 to 100 ratio? Well, I actually did a bunch of experiments a while back on both the ratio of water to dry plaster, as well as different mixing strategies. So basically, how long do you want it to mix? It actually turns out that I just rediscovered it was in this book. So this is Mold Making and Slip Casting by Andrew Martin. This book was recommended by Van Tiki, and it's actually a pretty good book. It covers lots of different topics. Here I have this Post-it. There is a section on plaster and mixing plaster, and so it actually talks about the same ratio of 70 to 100, and the mixing strategies are on this next page. Talks about the different phases of plaster, and it has 3 minutes of soaking and 3 minutes of mixing. I wound up with 3.5 minutes of soaking and 4 minutes of mixing, so very similar. I had done my experiments before I found this book, but it was nice to kind of rediscover the same things. So it was nice to know that I was on the right track. I'll go ahead and leave a link to this book in the description in case you're curious and want to know more. So this is our volume. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so that if I have any plaster, I don't need to scrape the bottom of the bucket. I'll maybe add 10%. And go ahead and measure all that up off camera. I've got everything set up for plaster. I went ahead and measured out the water. Here's the plaster. Here is our container that we're going to use for the plaster. Here's our mold form. And here is our bucket. And I've got my drill hanging off to the side with the paddle mixer. We're going to need a couple more things. First, as we saw, this is going to float. So what I'm going to do is, as it's floating, I'm going to take a board over the top of it, like that, and put a weight on here so it'll float against the surface. That way it doesn't pop out of the plaster. And it's always a good idea to use a mold release agent. This here is Murphy's soap. What we're going to do is put this on the outside of our mold and the inside of our bucket so that everything winds up being slick and hopefully the plaster will come out easier. So I just put some on a paper towel here and I'm just going to rub the outside. While I'm doing this, I went ahead and measured everything out by weight. So we had the volume in milliliters. We then used the equivalent number of grams of plaster and then 70% of that of water. There are recipes out there that measure everything by volume, and for water that's not a problem, it's the same. But for plaster it's a little bit tricky because the plaster can be aerated. It's like flour, it can have lots of air inside. So the volume measurement can actually change based upon how dense the plaster is. And that you don't know. So if you're measuring by volume, you may be inadvertently changing the ratio. Plaster is pretty forgiving in terms of its ratios, so it's probably okay. But again, I think better to do best practices and set yourself up for success. The other thing I did is I grabbed a bigger bucket. I don't think these smaller buckets are going to be big enough to mix all the plaster in. I'll go ahead and put the mold release on here. So we'll just let the plaster cure and ship it out when we're done. That's one coat. Let's go ahead and do another just to be safe. Worst comes to worst, the molds we can actually break and tear apart, but it's good practice in the future when we have more important molds to not be able to do that. All right, I think we are just about ready. One other quick note about the molds. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's actually a few things imprinted in the bottom of the mold. These are going to transfer into our pot, so we'll just clean those up later. So there's a little recycling symbol and a few other things in the bottom. If you wanted to, you could do a little bit more prep on the mold. Again, for the first one, I'm not worried about it. What we're going to do is we're going to put the dry onto the wet. So we're going to put the water into the big bucket. Then we'll slowly sprinkle in the dry ingredients and they will soak down into the water. We want to let them sit for 3.5 minutes. And then we're going to go ahead and mix for 4 minutes. And as we're mixing, it'll create a whirlpool. And we want to suck in as little air as possible. The air is going to create bubbles, and bubbles will transfer into our mold and create bad surface finishes. Even if we mix this perfectly, there's still going to be air in there, and that air is going to actually come from the dry plaster itself. In future videos, we will deal with bubbles. Right now, we just want to have a successful plaster mold that we can use. It may just require a little bit more cleanup at the very end. So let's go ahead and start that. So first, water into the big bucket. That's all of our water. So now we're going to take the plaster and slowly drizzle it in. And once we put that all in there, we'll go ahead and start our clock. And you'll see the plaster drip down. It's not a bad idea to use a mask while you're doing this. There's some dust in the air, but it'd be hard to talk to you. See all the bubbles coming out? That's all the air trapped into the plaster, the dry plaster. And from what I've read, plaster doesn't actually start curing until you start mixing it. Although I have not tested that myself. All right, that's all the dry. Spread that out a little bit so the water can suck it in. And I'm going to start the 3.5 minutes of slaking. See, the water has absorbed all that plaster. Bubbles coming out of the dry plaster. The slaking period, basically all the water is starting to seep into the plaster dust and just hydrating it all. Okay, it's been 3.5 minutes. Now we're going to mix for 4. Again, we're going to try not to get bubbles into this. One of the tricks in making sure you don't have bubbles is make sure you have a narrow enough container. You want it tall, you don't want it wide. This one's kind of on the edge. All right, this has been 4 minutes. Set this to the side, deal with it in a second. I'm going to tap the sides, see if we get more bubbles to come to the top. All right, then we pour. So long, thin streams are good if you can manage. I'm going to fill it maybe halfway. All right, I'm going to make sure that this gets wet on the bottom with plaster. And then go ahead and put my board on it. We'll move it around in a minute. Oh, and wait. And fill it most of the rest of the way. All right, I don't want to overflow. So now I'll slide this to the middle very carefully. So type out the bubbles. It's getting thixotropic, just like slip, which means it is viscous until it's shaken. All right, and that's the leftover plaster. Do not put this down the drain or any of the dry plaster down the drain. That's a bad day. I'm gonna go ahead and dump this out into my trash and then we'll clean it up later. Likewise for my paddle attachment, I'm gonna get a bucket and put this in some water and clean it off. So now the plaster will cure. This is an exothermic reaction, so it's gonna get warm. So as it sets, it will get warmer and warmer, and it doesn't take that long. It's like 15 minutes, half an hour. Oh, we can look in the book. So yeah, basically in about half an hour, it'll start to get hot. So let this sit for a while, and then we'll come back to it once it's all firmed up. And in the meantime, off camera, I'm gonna go ahead and start cleaning. Okay, it's been 45 minutes to an hour, and the plaster has cured. So here's what's left in the bucket, and it's cool and firm. And by the way, this is how we'll get it out of the bucket. We'll just break it up and chip it out. Do that later. Let's remove the weight and the board. And it looks like I did a pretty good job getting this centered. And it is damp and it's not too warm. So we can just go ahead and pull it out. And the answer is no. I'm gonna try and use the air compressor and blow some air in there. we go. A little bit of air. Pop. I think we created a bit of a vacuum on the bottom. There's the inside. That's what we'll use for our pot. Now let's see if we can get the bucket on the outside. Here we go. I felt it. All right, there it is. So here's our mold. Outside looks pretty good. You can see all the features I picked up from the bucket, even on the edge here. And there's the inside. So while this is still pretty wet and soft, I'm going to clean it up a little bit. So all these corners here are sharp. They're raised up a little bit as well, and they'll become fragile later, and it's just not nice to handle. So I found a putty knife, works pretty well. Just go ahead and scrape it. Plaster's really soft right now. There's a little bit of lip here that's up high, so go ahead and knock that down. And just barely break the edge here. And while we're at it, might as well knock this edge off here. All right, there we go. I think that is good enough. Some people will go much more extreme and sand all this off and make it more smooth. For me, I don't really care. It's functional this way. That's really your choice. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up the rest of this plaster mess, and we'll go ahead and let this finish curing and fully dry out, which will take several days. We can then use it to slip cast our first pot in this mold. All right, the mold is all dry. Let's go ahead and slip cast a pot. I went ahead and took a sponge and just wiped off some of the extra plaster dust that was sitting on it. And it basically looks the same as before. So now we can go ahead and slip cast it. So this is not going to be a tutorial on slip casting. I have other videos on that. So my slip's all mixed up here, and I'm just going to pour it in. All the way to the top. This is the very first time casting this pot, obviously. So I'm going to go ahead and let it sit for about half an hour, and then we'll dump out the slip, see how it looks. After that, we'll let it sit for a while longer, again, usually about half an hour, and we'll go ahead and demold it. One of the questions I often get is how long should the slip sit in the mold? And the answer is really it depends. So with my slip, my plaster, and my weather, I usually let it sit around half an hour. I do notice a difference between the winter and the summer when it's hot and dry versus cold and damp. So I just kind of have to play it by ear. Let's come back when the pot has formed and we're ready to dump the slip back out. Okay, the level of slip has dropped. That means the plaster is doing its job. It's pulling the water out of the slip. And so our pot should have formed. So let's go ahead and dump this out. Let's go ahead and put it back in my container here. All right, looks like I have a good wall. I'm gonna let this drain for a little while longer, and then we will come back to it and pop it out. This has been draining for about another half an hour. And you can see from the edges that it started to release. Let's go ahead and trim this off and we'll pop it out. Grab a wear board here. Usually when I trim it, it sticks a little bit, so it's helpful to release it. So make sure it's not stuck. And I've got big hands, so I can just pick these up and palm them. There we go. So there we go, it released just fine. If you look very closely, you might be able to see some dark spots in the bottom there. Those are little bubbles that slip got into. But looking at the pot itself, I think we've got a pretty good finish. See if I can get up close here. I mentioned before that there were some features in the bottom of the pot that got picked up, and so you can actually see the recycling symbol in the bottom, and there's a little logo here. Once this dries out a little bit, we can just clean that off. So there we go, there's the whole process. We went from a form that we want to make a copy of. We made the plaster mold, and now we have a brand new pot. Here's the top of the pot. It's probably a little too damp to handle, but I want to go ahead and show you. This one here had this little lip in it. I suspect what I'm going to do is cut this right there. Otherwise, the top here is a little bit wonky, and that's because there's no slip gallery in this mold. But that's something we'll address in the next video. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and let this dry to leather hard, clean up the rim, address the bottom, and then let it dry to bone dry. And now I can go and make new pots using my new mold. So there you have it. That's a great way to go and make your first slip casting plaster mold. One piece molds are relatively simple, as I showed you, and they're actually pretty effective. As I showed early on, I still use these relatively often in my own process. I hope you found that interesting. In the next video, we'll do an iteration on this and see if we can improve the mold a little bit more. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.